Alright, how's it going there, Algebra 2 people? Algebra 2C. Alright, so this video is going to really, for sure, talk about Lesson 7-4 and how to find a common denominator. And I want you to look at these four examples that I have ready, and I have one more on top of this. But you can see that adding and subtracting these fractions looks like a challenge. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this, it is a challenge. I really hope you watch that first video because I'm going to make a lot of references to how I did common denominator in that video. And remember, that video, if you didn't watch it yet, that video was just using regular fractions and numbers, like none of this x and x squared and binomial and trinomial stuff. It was just numbers. But the idea of how that happened, all the background of how those worked, comes in here. So I'm going to try to take as much of a consistent approach as I did then and go from there. Now, your job this week is only to be able to find the common denominator. That's all I'm going to do. I know there's a full problem here that's asking us add these two fractions. Find the common denominator. That's your only job. I don't want anything else done. Okay? So here are the steps, and I'm going to kind of say them out loud. It'd be different if I was in my classroom where my boards are big and I got room to put things, and these are small. So I'm going to tell you the steps, and if you need to write them down and pause and go back, do so, please. Number one, when you go to search for a common denominator, your job is to factor the current denominators as much as possible. And that means everything. Do factoring like you know how to factor binomials, and do factoring like I showed you in the video prior to this, which is called breaking things down to its prime factors, prime factorization. I'm going to do it all. So, starting here, this denominator of 9x squared. Now, that's not a binomial or a trinomial that factors like we've learned. I'm talking the prime factorization from just the previous video. So, think of the way, what's the most bare bones broken down way I can write 9x squared is 3 times 3 times x times x. That's the most broken down I can make it. This is more of a binomial, and we're going to approach it that way. See, that's what makes this difficult, is sometimes they're binomials and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're binomials and sometimes they're trinomials. It's a mixture. This binomial has a greatest common factor of 3x. And when I factor that out, it leaves me with x plus 1. So there is the prime factorization, if you will. And now it's my job, like we did in that previous video, say, how do you come up with your common denominator? Notice I separated the groups. Whatever they share, write once and cross it off. So they share. And by the way, shared groups are what's separated by multiplication. So if I'm being picky over here, there's a times sign there, and there's a times sign there. This goes as a group because it's a plus sign, so it must travel as a group. So they share a 3 here and a 3 here. Write it down once. They share an x here and an x here. Write it down once. Don't call this a shared x. It's attached to plus. That has to be a group and stay that way. Looking across the board, they don't share anything else. There's a 3 here, but not another 3 here. There's a multiply by x here, but there's not another multiply by x over here. There's an x plus 1 here, but not an x plus 1 there. Folks, that means everything that's still not crossed out all needs to go thrown into the common denominator. See, you take what they share once. That's why I took, you see 2 3s there? Write it once. 2 multiplied by x's, write it once. and then everything else has to just be thrown into the pile. So what is that? This 3, this x, and this x plus 1. Now, all of that multiplied together is your common denominator, and typically you multiply the single terms out front and you leave the parenthesis groups as parentheses. So if I'm looking at this, there's a 3 times 3, which is 9. There's an x times x, which is x squared. The common denominator would be 9x squared times x plus 1. Kind of tricky business. I'm not gonna tell you this is easy. This is an area that we teach very diligently when we're in school, which is why your whole week's worth of lesson this week is just, can I find the common denominator? Not doing anything outside of that. So let's go over to this one. This one's going to be different, and I actually think part of it might be easier. We'll see. So this common denominator. So again, no matter what, you start by factoring the denominators as much as possible. This 2x minus 2 has a greatest common factor of 2. So I'll pull that, and I divide the 2 out of here, leaves me x minus 1. That's all I can do. 2's a prime factor, x minus 1, so we're good. Separate it. This is a trinomial, so it's got the hopes of doing this. I mean, we spent a lot of time on factoring, even in the short 4.5 days we were together. And the previous videos that I've shared with you focused heavily on factoring, so I'm hoping you got that. Because of this x squared, this is x and x. Because of that being positive 3, multiply, but a minus 4 in the middle, would be minus 1 minus 3. See that negative 1 times negative 3 is positive 3. This gives me negative 3x. This gives me minus 1x. Minus 3x minus 1x is minus 4. There's the factoring. Okay? Separated. Everything's factored as much as possible. So now I start, and remember, you take pieces that are separated by multiply. So there's an understood times right there. There's a times right there. This is very different from that last one because we don't have all these little teeny prime factorization pieces. We have a 2, but that's it. So we look over here to group 1 versus group 2. What do they share? They share x minus 1. Write it down once. Do they share anything else? 2's over there, x minus 3 over here. No, they don't share anything else. Throw it into the pile. Now I'm going to organize this. I'm going to throw the 2 out front because numbers don't go out front, and times x minus 3. I am not going to distribute those back together. Once we factor and come up with a common denominator, we're going to leave it in factored form. There's your common denominator. Okay? They shared the x minus 1. You see it once. So you didn't have to write 2 times x minus 1 times x minus 1 times x minus 3. You didn't need all of that. Things that appear on both groups get represented once. Moving over here. Now, this is an interesting case where people get to this one and they're like, I don't know what to do. Well, here's something kind of interesting. Maybe that's a bad word. Just different. This denominator of 3x plus 2 doesn't factor in any way. Doesn't have a greatest common factor or anything. This also doesn't factor. Now, there was an example that I did in the previous video where I asked something like, I have it written down right here, I asked you to do 3/5 plus 2/3, meaning that the denominators were 5 and 3. And those numbers don't break down, they're prime. So what do you do when you're in a bind like that? 5 and 3, just times them together and call it 15. Or just call it 3 times 5. We're in that boat right here. This doesn't factor, that's all it's got. This doesn't factor, that's all it's got. So when you're in a bind like that and they have nothing in common and they're just totally different and they don't factor, the common denominator is them multiplied. That's it. Making a mess here. You know how I am about my board. I'm just kind of a weirdo. But yeah, that's it. That's all I've got. So, once you know what you're doing with that, that's actually just, you got to kind of take that as, that's not a bad problem. It's in your favor if nothing factors, because it times it is the common denominator, and that works out pretty nicely. Okay, over here, now I do have one more example, so I'm going to pause in a minute, but here's number 4. Now we're back to a little bit more challenging stuff. So number 1, factor. So we got ourselves a trinomial here. That will factor like so. That's x. This is going to be plus 3 minus 4. If you check out that factoring, it distributes back to specifically x squared minus 4x plus 3x minus 12. The minus 4x plus 3x makes negative 1x, so there we go. Separated from this factoring. This has a greatest common factor of 12, which leaves me x minus 4. See? 12x minus 48. 12 times 4. Okay. That's as much factoring as that can do. Everything's factored to the best of our ability. 2 groups separated, and we do the whole grouping thing. Now remember, there is multiplication here, and there's multiplication there. We look at each group and say, what do they share? Throw it into the common denominator pile. They share an x minus 4. Write it down. Cross it off. They shared it. We used it once. They don't share anything else. That means the rest of the stuff goes right into the pile. The 12, I'll put that out front. It looks better out there. And the times x plus 3. There's your common denominator. Now I'm going to pause and erase something so that I can do one final example, which is going to be similar to the last example, but not the same, just similar. And before I pause, I want to say something about the 4 problems that are up here together. We might revisit these 4 problems in the following week, because in the following week, we're actually going to do the questions in full. Like, we're going to find the common denominator, change to the common denominator, alter the numerators like they're supposed to, and do the addition, do the subtraction. So I might revisit these so that you're like, hey, I already saw how to do the common denominator, and that part will be nice. So pause a minute, going to erase a question so that I can put up the 5th example, and we'll go from there. Okay, so here's our 5th example in the group. And again, I'm going to end this video with that 5th example. And I'll write this in the directions as well, but if you guys do these 5, look at these 5 examples and then go to the assignment that is sent to you, and you're just like, I can't get this, like, because like last week there was a problem. They're like, you know what, I don't know how to do, like, I don't remember what it was, like number 4 and 6 look kind of weird, and I made an alternate video to help out with that. I might do that if I find out that you're struggling, because it's really difficult when I can't like just talk to you one-on-one. So just understand, I'm going to stop this with this example, and then if there are more issues that need to be discussed, I'll make another video to try to address those. But it's up to you to give me feedback. It's super important that you just send me a Google Classroom message or something to that effect to say, hey, this one's a struggle, and I'll address that, okay? So here we go. Not changing the path here. We're going to take our 2 denominators. We're going to factor them to the best of our ability. This being a trinomial. X and X. The multiply to negative 24 combination we need that will work with this is a minus 3 plus 8. Negative 3 times 8 is negative 24. This multiplies to 8x. This multiplies to minus 3x. 8 minus 3 is 5x. Good. This Doesn't factor in any way. No GCF, no nothing. Just doesn't factor. So there's our two pieces. Same process as always. Do they share something? Cross it out, write it once into the common denominator piece. They share x minus 3. You write it once. You don't write x minus 3 times x plus 8 times x minus 3. You don't just write everything you see. If they share it, goes into once. After that, whatever is left, throw it into the pile. X plus 8. And there's that common denominator. Now, the beauty, there's good and bad with this video stuff. You know, the beauty of it is you can pause it and say, oops, I didn't hear what he said there, and back it up and look at it again and kind of see it, and you can replay it. That's the nice part about the videos. You know, the downside is you can't just stop it and say, hey, Mr. Allen, ask me a question. So there's good to this and there's a downside to this, because being in the classroom, we can always talk one-on-one anytime. So make the best of it, you guys. And like I said, pause this, back it up, do what you got to do, and watch it as many times as necessary to get the understanding. And again, give me feedback through Google Classroom. If this is not answering the questions well enough for you to do the assignment, I got to know about it, and I will address it through another video. All right? Take care, you guys.